there's an aquifer underneath that 133,000 acre base. And what's happening is the military has drilled wells, but apparently they don't use that water because they import water. So does that tell us that there's poisoning? I mean, we need to know, people need to know what's happened to the aquifer under the base. So, and that's not public. There's been very little transparency. So I think that there's a lever right there. Let's find out what's happened in the past and what your plans mean for the harm that will go forward and into the future.
Aloha. In today's conversation, we're going to be bringing together two topics that are normally kept apart, but that our guest argues are historically and economically and institutionally and politically entwined. The climate crisis on the one hand, and military doctrine and practice and national security on the other. Neta Crawford is our guest, and she is an expert on military history and international relations. She is the author of 4 books and dozens of journal articles. She's a professor at the University of St. Andrews in Scotland and a co-founder of the Costs of War Project at Brown. She's been elected to both the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and to the British Academy, and she is the author of a new book which recently won the American Book Award titled The Pentagon, Climate Change and War, and that's mainly what we're going to be talking about today. Thank you so much for joining us, Neta.
I'm really happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
And you're on island for some time doing a research project related to Hawaii?
Yes, a group of us are here working with people in Hawaii to understand the impact of the military bases long term in Hawaii and looking in particular at the leases that are up for renewal.
Well, this is well timed in that case. And in today's conversation, we'll kind of do a deep background, but also, I think, get back up to the present and hear preliminarily what some of your findings are and thoughts are on that base renewal debate that's going on right now. Can you distill your claims in a nutshell for us?
I think there are 3 things to keep in mind. First of all, because the Kyoto Protocol negotiations, which established the framework for counting greenhouse gases which cause increased warming, did not include military emissions for a long time, people did not understand the extent, the scale of military emissions, and they still don't because they're really essentially uncounted and undocumented. The second claim of the book was that the United States military in particular was the largest institutional user of energy in the United States, as well as the largest greenhouse gas emitter in the world, the single largest greenhouse gas emitter in the world, because of its extensive use of fossil fuel. And the third claim is essentially that if you understand military emissions, and as the military itself does, because they know what their emissions are, and you understand their concern over climate change leading to conflict, then one would think that they'd be concerned about not only their own military-related emissions, but the world's emissions, which are actually sort of tied to, and I can explain how this is, tied to U.S. operations and doctrine. So that's part of what I've been doing with this work. And there are many other people across the world who have been trying to understand the scope, the scale, the sources of military and military-industrial emissions. But my book was focused on the U.S. because it was the largest emitter, and I understand the U.S. from having worked on U.S. military doctrine and war for about 40 years.
One of the things that's fascinating about the book is not only the colossal emissions that the U.S. military machine, the largest in the world, is producing right now, but the long kind of interplay or the development of military technologies and the way that they're connected with innovations in fuels from the 18th century forward. And I wonder if you might just kind of sketch out for us a little bit of that history that...
Right. I think most people understand military history as the development of innovations in technologies,
right.
Like from crossbow to, single shot weapons to repeating weapons and so on, then ultimately to the atomic bomb. But if you think about the need for militaries to get to places that is project power from one location to another, you are deep into logistics. And that's another way to understand military history. The thing that happened in the 19th century, really beginning in the late 18th century, is the move away from arms and legs and wind and wave, horses to steam-powered locomotion. And that steam-powered locomotion gives you, first wood as the fuel, then coal, and then eventually we move into other fuels. But the point is it gives you a more reliable, in some senses, source of energy. And the key things that happen are you move in Massachusetts from powering weapons manufacturing, that is muskets and other arms, with a mill, and you're dependent on the level of water in the river, to powering your manufacturing with coal and the steam engines there, and then you're also powering the locomotion of first steamships, paddle steamships, and then other kinds of steamships, which then changes the ability of navies to get further, more reliably, not depending on the wind. But then they have to have coaling stations to get the coal.
Right. It seems what's kind of interesting about it is that once they develop that ability to move mass numbers of people reliably and equipment through railroads, then they need more and more coal around the world, and then eventually oil.
Right. So one of the interesting things that happens in the 19th century, late 19th century, is there's a focus on what's the most efficient form of coal. And there's a research that the Navy engages in to find out, well, how far can we get on this type of coal, this bituminous coal versus the anthracite coal, and what their preferences are. That's a sort of stream of military industrial innovation that goes back to the 19th century. But there's also the need to get coaling stations. And that's how Hawaii came into the picture for me, when I realized that, Hawaii is essential in the 19th century to U.S. and merchants who are after whales and whale oil, but it becomes important in the 1840s and 1850s as the U.S. wants to move to do a little bit more trade in the East, the Far East. And so they're interested in going to Japan and China, and so this is a good spot, as are other islands, to get fresh water and then coal, and then you can move on. And so part of the thing they're doing when Commander Perry goes to China in the 1840s is trying to get a source of coal there. But this Pearl Harbor becomes an important coaling station for the U.S. Navy at that point. But it's, of course, Hawaii is not yet a state, and there's the acquisition of a lease on the area that is now called Pearl Harbor, and then eventually the attempt during the U.S. war with Spain to formalize that relationship, as well as with the other islands that are taken during that war, for instance, Guam.
When does the transition move to oil? In World War I, from World War I forward, or even earlier?
It starts earlier in Britain, that transition. There are people who are saying coal is good, fine, we want to stick with the coal, this is what we have. There are always people who want to stick with the technology that they have, and then they know, and they have reliable supplies. The British don't really have a hold on the oil fields in the Middle East until during World War I, and the economic arrangements are sort of tenuous. The U.S. and the British are fighting over the access to the oil. These companies are fighting over access to the oil there. But the technological transition is really first with the Navy, because what we don't have yet are, through World War I, horses are the main form of locomotion for infantries and the cavalry. But in World War I, you make the transition to tanks. You start to see that transition, and then that continues in the interwar period. There's more aircraft being used, and they need a form of liquid fuel. All of this receives a jump in that period. So during the war, there's a transition to petroleum, but there's still a lot of coal actually used on ships in World War II.
It also, so once militaries become dependent on coal and then on liquid fuels, they need access and supplies, especially if you want to project power globally in a world war or you're trying to keep together an empire or become one. You need access to fuel around the world. It seems like there's this self-fulfilling logic.
Right. So at first, the United States is dependent on basically the kindness of either the commercial people, the merchants they're buying the coal from, or the British network, because the British have the largest navy and global presence and coaling stations in the 19th century. And the U.S. depends on those networks and those stations to get its supplies. It's really in 1908, 1909, when Roosevelt sends the Great White Fleet around the world, that the United States thinks, we must advance on this 19th century vision of becoming a maritime power. And as soon as the United States wants to be a maritime power, it needs its own bases and sort of autonomy from the British, and they start investing more in that. And so, yes, once you have the bases, you have to protect the bases. You have to protect access to that stuff, and that becomes a motive for or a consideration in foreign policy. So then the Middle East becomes quite important, first for the British, and then later when the United States takes over those bases, when the British sort of depart in the 1960s, for the U.S. to have bases in the Middle East.
It's interesting, too, then if one country has this constellation of fossil fuel stations and supply routes, then their rivals want to have them, too. I mean, of course, that was part of the impetus for World War II, was
the
Japanese oil embargo on Japan.
Right. So the United States has an embargo on Japanese oil. When the United States and Japan go to war, they're fighting over war in oil in Southeast Asia as well. And the United States embargoes and essentially quarantines Japan during the war because the Japanese don't have their own oil. They still don't have their own oil. They're importing oil. And that becomes part of the sanctions against Japan, which ultimately strangles the Japanese economy and increases their vulnerability towards the end of the war. Right, so they wanted to cut off supplies of oil to the Japanese homeland, but also make the Japanese military weaker by decreasing their supply of oil.
So in the wake of World War II, where the U.S. really, becomes a true global every ocean superpower, how is that entwined with the development of petroleum and ultimately emissions?
Well, there's a couple of things that are going on. One is during the wars, there's a lot of transition of different materials, right? So you go from wood in aircraft, for instance, to plastics. So you need petroleum to make plastics. You go from one kind of using in World War I a fertilizer plant to make fertilizer, then the fertilizer plant becomes a place to manufacture TNT. And then you transition back in between the wars to fertilizer, and then you move back to TNT in World War II, and then you increase the need for fertilizer of a certain kind. So they want to keep that going. So war itself changes the civilian economy. That's essentially what we're looking at. And also after the wars, there's a lot of surplus aircraft. So that surplus aircraft goes to commercial airline industries, and that's the beginning of what we see as a large aviation industry. And so there's that commercial use of fuel goes up. So you want to protect access, not only for your military, but also you want lower prices for the commercial uses of fuel.
That's an important point to underscore, I think, the ways the military is implicated in emissions has to do with its own consumption, but also devising new technologies that then under pressure of conflict that then get adopted across other economies, and in kind of distorting industries in ways that has repercussions.
Yeah, there's another way as well. During World War One, there was a desire to move people and material from the middle of the country or the far west of the country to the East Coast for use in Europe. And Eisenhower, who was not yet a general in World War One, is part of the crew of people who are trying to figure out after the war, well, how can we make this more efficient? So he gets this vision. We need he sees we need an interstate highway system. So and he's also seen how important transport is, this sort of German network, the Autobahn is for the Germans, right? So what they want to do is move material quickly, and they also want to move people out of the center of the city. By the time we get to Eisenhower, actually, in World War II, and then in his presidency, having an understanding of the effects of nuclear war, we want to have what is initially called the interstate and defense highway system. It was part of a vision of national defense to have that interstate system. So all of these
not
highways,
just to move material, but for evacuations.
Yes, evacuations from cities in the case of war.
But out of it comes suburban life and remaking of the whole modern world, kind of.
Yes, that increased fuel use, automobile use, and so on. The decline of tighter cities and suburbanization, and then more homes, more stuff.
Right.
Some of it made with petroleum products.
I mean, by the middle of the 19th century, clearly the Middle East becomes like the focal point. But it was interesting to me that the Central Command wasn't formed until the Reagan administration. So how much attention was there? How much of an obsession was oil availability and access and control before the Central Command, and then how did the Central Command kind of come about?
Right, so it really goes back to the Carter administration. There's a couple things that happened in 1979. The first is the Afghans are invaded by the Soviet Union. And there's an argument and a fear, a concern that the Soviets won't just stop with Afghanistan, they're going to march all the way to the Middle East and take Iran. The concern there is that, what if the Soviets get a stranglehold on Middle East oil?
Oh, I see. Same time as the Iranian Revolution.
And right, the second thing is the Iranian Revolution, which then is the United States, the fear that they can't control the price of oil and they can't control the politics there. And it's very anti-American because the U.S. has been supporting, essentially, even though the Shah claims royal prerogatives, he's not well liked, right? And so the revolution is partly because not just for religious reasons, but because the Shah is an autocrat.
And of course, this is on the heels of the oil embargo of the early 70s.
Right. There'd been a concern during the Nixon administration, especially, but then going into Ford and Carter, that the United States could be held hostage to the rising fuel costs if there's an embargo, if there's some cutoff. So Carter, with executive order, says it's known as the Carter Doctrine. He says we're going to defend access to the oil in the Middle East out of concern about the rising prices. And if the price goes up too high, it's going to hurt the U.S. economy. And when the price does go up, it does hurt the U.S. economy because it's dependent on this fuel. And in particular, it's not so much that there isn't going to any fuel. It's just the price is really high and it's hurting people.
Right.
Right. And so it's really Carter that moves the United States to this doctrine of defending the Persian Gulf area with U.S. forces. He sets up command to do this, and it's during the Reagan administration that it becomes Central Command. All the commands are sort of renamed in a sense. So now you've had for a long time Pacific Command, now it's called Indo-Pacific Command. And that's part of the sort of reorientation of the United States to Asia during, first the Obama administration and then Trump and Biden.
Okay, then a decade later, the U.S. actually goes to war, first in response to Iraq's invasion of Kuwait, and then after 9/11 to overthrow the government of Iraq. But both of those wars, especially the second, were phenomenally expensive in terms of the dollars expended just by DoD at the time. But I know part of your research was trying to account for the array of costs that were related or might be unseen or long-term from those two conflicts. And I wonder if you might just highlight a bit of that research just so that we might think more fully about the costs, economic and ecological, of military confrontations, because a lot of the dollars are a little invisible, I think.
Right. Okay. So there is a way to think about the cost of war, just in terms of what the Department of Defense is allocated by Congress. And during the post 9/11 wars, at the beginning of the crisis, following the attack on 9/11, the Congress gave emergency money to the DoD. And this is not part of the usual appropriation process. There is a National Defense Authorization Act and several other acts that give money to the Department of Defense to do their regular operations. So they gave emergency money to them, and for many years it was just an emergency money. And then after a certain point, these are another form of appropriation. But essentially, it's out of the mainstream. It's in its own little bucket. And there is, in almost every other war in the past, the U.S. has funded its wars not through emergency appropriations like this, but through a process where there are hearings, there's a discussion of the strategy, Congress authorizes the money, taxes are raised or war bonds are bought.
Right.
Taxes were not raised. If you'll recall, President Bush said, go shopping. That's how you can help.
Right.
And in that instance, yeah, maybe shopping is good because you can get the tax revenue, but essentially the United States borrowed. So that's the first hidden cost, is the borrowing to pay for these wars, and sold bonds to others, right? But there was no increased taxation. But these wars cost a lot, and the appropriations went on, and they were essentially outside the regular Department of Defense budgets. These emergency, it was called
there's
overseas.
The dollars spent, then there's the debt servicing, which, just like when you buy a house, might mean double or triple what the original price tag was by the time the bill was paid.
Right. So the wars ended in 2021 in Afghanistan, and we're still paying. We'll be paying for quite a while. There was about $2 trillion in appropriations through this overseas contingency operation money, the emergency money. And it went not just to DOD, but to the Homeland Security Department, which was created following 9/11. And the Homeland Security has its own sort of, it actually had charge of defending us in case something like a 9/11 attack occurred, and against anthrax and so on. So they get money above the DOD money for wars. And then the other thing to think about is the expense of caring for veterans. Now, as you recall...
Because those aren't included, right, in these appropriations, the long-term for injuries and mental health and homelessness and...
No, it's not. Right, so...
pensions and everything else.
Right, it's and the education benefits that they're promised and get and should have.
Yeah.
Right. So if you think about veterans' money... and in addition, you had to raise, because people didn't want to be deployed 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 times to these war zones, they had to raise wages and engage in stop loss. And stop loss is saying, even though your term of service is up, you can't leave. So they were falling down on recruiting their goals, not meeting their goals for recruitment. So wages went up to make things more attractive. There's, in general, sort of an inflation of the medical part of the DoD budget and wages and benefits because of the wars. But the thing about the veterans is they come home and they're sicker than other veterans of previous wars, partly because they're doing these multiple deployments, partly because they're in a war zone, which is very difficult. They're carrying heavy packs. They're breathing in aerosolized dust. And as you recall, they had burn pits for some of the waste, and that is toxic fumes that are the service members and the contractors were exposed to, as well as the people in the areas around the burn pits, the civilians. So to think about those costs, and we'll be, again, paying for those, because the veterans of these wars will deserve their benefits the entire rest of their life. And that's a not insignificant part of the federal budget.
And of course, that doesn't count the costs incurred in the region to infrastructure in Iraq, rebuilding costs in Iraq, lives lost in
Right.
Iraq. So did you try in that research to account for all of those
Yes.
costs, foreign and domestic?
Yeah. Right. So some of the Department of Defense budget went to reconstruction. There was other reconstruction money that went through the Agency for International Development. Some State Department money went for reconstruction. There was hardening of the State Department buildings so that if there were an attack, State Department personnel would be safe. So the State Department budget went up in those places, but did not go up overall. And then in terms of the people themselves in the region, some of those projects worked, some of them did not. There was also what was known then as money as a weapon system. Money was handed out to buy friends in Afghanistan and Iraq. And then in addition, there were projects aimed at education of women and so on, and those more or less worked at the time that they were operable.
It's important, this research, since oftentimes these wars are justified in strategic terms as necessary to stabilize the global order and keep the global economy running. But when the price tag starts getting as high as you are suggesting, I imagine the advocates' math quits working. The advocates for this kind of massive military intervention, supposedly in the interest of global stabilization or energy stabilization.
Yeah, but so I don't think that the 9/11 wars were justified on oil. They were about safety and about protecting us from the supposed weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, which were not there, and the Al-Qaeda and other terrorist forces in Afghanistan. But essentially, one of the interests becomes controlling the price of oil, because it is dependent on some stability in the region. And when then candidate Trump and then President Trump said, well, we could just take that oil, that's not perceived very well in the region. But so the larger costs of the war I understood in terms of humans and dollars, but I did not understand when I started this work in 2010 about the environmental costs and consequences of war.
Yeah, so let's go there. I mean, you mentioned that the U.S. military is the largest institutional emitter.
All right, so the U.S. military will tell you that they're the United States' single largest energy user, all forms of energy. And I don't know if they're proud of that or not proud of that. It's just a fact, right? And they are consuming all sorts of energy. So they're consuming geothermal, wind. They have solar panels, but most of their energy is either bought from the grid, or they're producing it on bases, or they're using it in operations. So you can think of it as two buckets, essentially. Installations and bases bucket, which is about a third of their energy use, and their emissions for greenhouse gases from.
That's more than I thought.
And then the rest of it,
aviation and.
It's operational, right? What they call operational fuel use.
Okay.
And some of that is for war, but some of that is for exercises with other countries or training in the United States.
And so what does it come to compared to, say, other countries or other large institutional emitters?
Right. So because the United States economy is so large and its emissions are so large, it's about 1.5% to 2% of U.S. total emissions.
Though more if you add in the military contractors and.
Right. If you add in the military industrial piece and the contractors, it's about 3%, right? Which is a large portion of the entire U.S., individual and business and government emissions. So what that means is the U.S. military, with its now about 700 bases, which have their emissions, which are not counted. I mean, what happened in 1998 is kind of interesting.
I was going to ask about what was the justification for excluding them from Kyoto?
Well, what happened was that the Department of Defense sent over to the Clinton administration a memo saying, look, at Kyoto, you should not let them count and report military emissions, because they argued that essentially they implied as soon as they're counted, people want to count them. And if
Right.
and if we had a cut of, let's say, even 10% of our emissions, that would be devastating for training and for readiness.
I see.
And so the Clinton administration agreed, and they sent Ambassador Eisenstadt to Kyoto to negotiate this, and he brought with them people from the Department of Defense to work, in a sense, to work the room and to get other countries to go along with not including military emissions in the standard reporting. And it doesn't have its own category. You can't get transparency on it. And bunker fuels, that is international aviation and naval fuels, are not included. And some domestic military aviation, you can look at the US EPA report and find it, but you don't have the big picture, and it's not separate. So I had to calculate, based on fuel use, U.S. military emissions from 1975 to the point when we get some transparency around 2008. What I learned in calculating this is, and I don't have the data prior to 1975, I just can't find the fuel use data for the U.S. military, but what I learned is, 75 it's around 110 million metric ton CO2e, okay, which is more than twice what it is now. So in 75, it's going down from the Vietnam War.
I see.
Right. And then during the Carter administration, it's still going down. The emissions are going down a bit, sort of get down from this war mobilization.
And also improved efficiency, or more
There's
just
there's not
demobilization?
much improved
Okay.
efficiency. The whole story of improved efficiency is complicated, but basically what happens is they're not operating as much. Remember, 70% of it is operational, and they're not deploying to Hawaii or Japan or to wherever they're going to get to bomb Cambodia or operate on the ground in Vietnam. It's just a dramatic decrease in fuel use for operations. And the United States still has thousands of military bases abroad at this point, right? And through the Cold War. So military emissions go up during the Reagan administration. Then they're up for the 1991 Gulf War. They go up to 109 million metric tons CO2 equivalent, so up to sort of post-1975 numbers. And then they start to go down again during what we thought of as the end of the Cold War. And then after 9/11, they go up again. And they went up until around, I think it's 2013, 2014, and they started to go down as the U.S. downsized its presence in Iraq and Afghanistan. And they've been going down because there's been a couple things that happened. One, base realignment and closure with the end of the Cold War, go from around 2,000 bases in the world and installations of all sorts to about 1,000, and now we're down to, as I said, around 700.
It's interesting that in Hawaii, in the climate discourse, sometimes the military is held up not as a colossal emitter, but as an adapter and innovator. Like on the Marine base on the windward side, the Marine base there is often held up for its microgrid for solar and its wave research. And like, to what extent is that smokescreen, or to what extent is the military in some senses like advancing research that could lead to efficiency breakthroughs or alternative fuel breakthroughs? Or
Yeah. Okay, so credit where credit is due. They have got some good efficiencies, and they have put up solar panels. I, in fact, saw the Marine base and the solar panels. Some of them have come down recently. I don't know why. Those solar panels have come off residential buildings. I saw the wave collection on the base, and it is true they've got microgrids as well, and they've been working on battery technology. They have achieved some installation efficiencies, but the big efficiency was switching from coal to oil. Right, that was the big decline in energy use, and the U.S. government has essentially stopped using coal at most of its, or in fact, all other facilities except the DoD still has some coal. Okay, so that's an important thing. That's good. They move
Sure.
to other forms of energy generation, and they do use geothermal, and they have this wave research and so on. That's great. The efficiency of that, though, is less than if it were done in the commercial sector or by universities. And, Office of Naval Research pays for a lot of the research here at the University of Hawaii and in many other universities, and they always have done since World War II, been funding a lot of research. Now, interestingly, the Navy's always been ahead on climate change too, right? So think about it as they're the most vulnerable because they've got to deal when they send in ships to a port. They've got to understand, what's the port look like? Is my ship going to hit bottom?
Right.
They have to understand that. And so they're concerned about sea level rise and then changing ports. They're concerned about changing salinity so that their anti-submarine warfare equipment will function correctly. Have to understand that. And they're concerned about weather extremes, too hot, too cold, too many torrential rains, too little water.
I see. So they're like looking hard into the science, but not in a serious way assessing their own impact on the production of the climate crisis.
No, they're not looking at the production of. That's what happened with the Clinton administration. They essentially said, we're not going to look there. But what they have been doing, and doing well, is understanding the impact of climate change on their bases, installation, on their training, on their operations. And then more recently, in the last 20 years or so, they moved to being concerned about two other things. One is how climate change will feed into instability in different zones, and the other is on their concern about a rogue nation. This is very recent. They're concerned about a rogue nation actually trying to do some radical transformation of the climate by geoengineering. Okay, so they're concerned about that. And so if the U.S. controls geoengineering, they're fine with it. But if some other country like China or Russia were to do it, they're concerned.
On the DoD's kind of like strategic concern that political instability caused by drought or climate migration, are they using that as kind of justification for continued forward deployment and spending because the world is becoming more dangerous, even though they're the ones kind of like, at least in part, pushing the danger forward?
I think that the concern about instability would be a concern of whether or not it affected their budget. They look around the world, they look for things that could come to a neighborhood near you, and they say, climate change is going to come to a neighborhood near you in the form of migrants or war, instability, changing prices of commodities that the U.S. depends on. And they want to defend against all risks. And so they're very attentive to those risks. Again, not making the causal connection. And then the other thing that's important to realize, I think, is that instability does not necessarily lead to crisis and war. Okay, because what the intervening variable, if you will, there is the capacity of governments to help people in place deal with floods or droughts or persistent high temperatures, and our capacity to increase the rate of the sequestration of carbon through other means. And there's all these things we can do to prevent that causal chain from climate change caused hardship and misery to war.
Well, and that's, we just did a program recently with the author Rebecca Solnit, and she wrote an interesting book on disasters in which she looked at all of these different disasters and found that police and military authorities who were used to deploying hard force and projecting violence through their institutions that they commanded always imagined that in the wake of disasters, looting and mayhem would break out, and therefore order needed to be restored by force. But in fact, what she found in her research is that most of the time when disaster strikes, people come together and help each other. And it's community and purpose that forms, not mayhem. There are different ways of conceiving the future of the climate crisis too, as a imperative to come together and cooperate and cope, or imagining it as a zero-sum game in which, the hoarders with the most guns survive.
Right. So you can think about your country or your place as a lifeboat, and you can let people in or keep them out.
Yeah.
And Solnit's research is really compelling on this point and the sort of natural disasters that she's looked at. But there are alternative paths to get to sustainable development, to sort of survive the coming, rise in sea level. And I don't think the military is a solution on any of these alternative paths. It is a cause of increased emissions and potentially tension.
The dollar cost and the emissions cost are just very high.
Right.
I mean, it's that my own area is criminal justice, and it's kind of analogous. Like there's a lot of different ways to deal with, say, severe drug addiction. All of the ways are kind of difficult. It's a difficult problem to solve. But the most expensive one is locking people up in jail, just like the most expensive solution to a conflict usually, I imagine your research seems to underscore, is war.
Yeah, blood and treasure are expended at phenomenal rates. Just think about what the Russians are doing in Ukraine. They're throwing wave after wave of young Russians at the Ukrainians. More than 250,000 of them have died, of the Russians alone. And they're no closer to controlling Ukraine than a year and a half ago, right? So it's maybe they'll win,
right?
But maybe they'll hold on to the little bit of territory they have, but at a great cost. And we haven't even talked about what they're spending.
Yeah, generational, cultural, and civilizational costs, and the same in Gaza, more so. I mean, just that in terms of the level of destruction that I think we haven't really. I mean, I guess there was maybe comparable levels of destruction in Fallujah, but maybe not quite as much. Maybe not since World War II. Have we seen
70-something% of the
cities leveled
structure
as-
of the structures in Gaza are destroyed or damaged?
But I think that's
Significantly
more
damaged.
than we've seen since like Dresden, Tokyo, like carpet bombings of World War II.
It's any war that gets like this ends up looking like that. Any sort of prolonged bombardment of urban areas, and but this is the rate, the speed of this destruction was phenomenal. The level of displacement, more than 95% of the people have moved more than once in Gaza. It's just been extremely difficult in terms of just the capacity to survive. There's no safe drinking water. Most of the medical facilities have been damaged or destroyed. They had 34 hospitals, and I think 14 were functional last month.
Well, and just I don't even know how you would begin to analyze assess what the cost might be over the lifespan of kids who are going to face difficulties from trauma and malnutrition for their whole lives, and
Right. Now, but think about Afghanistan, the Afghan war. Most of the children there have, mental health problems before the U.S. left.
right.
That was the research that was done by doctors there, and there'll be the same level of trauma in Gaza. And there's trauma all over from war.
I want to shift to a more a peaceful arena, but also a really critical one that you're working on right now, and that is bringing the conversation back to Hawaii. Could you place briefly Hawaii into kind of like U.S. military history from Pearl Harbor and the Bayonet Constitution forward, so we can kind of understand how Hawaii became a strategic focal point for the U.S. and really why the base infrastructure became in Hawaii so intense as a portion of the landmass compared to other places around the world.
We'll just start with the top numbers, and that is there are about 255,000 acres of the state of Hawaii which are devoted to the bases and installations here, and the easements to get to them, right? And about 47,000 of those acres are up for negotiation right now. Those have to be pretty important acres, but the whole infrastructure of the bases begins, of course, with the 19th century and the coaling station and its role, Hawaii's role in not just World War II, but prior to that, of course, the war in the Philippines, the war with Spain, It's essential for that. It's important in the the Korean War and the Vietnam War. And many of these bases are legacy bases from that period, and the operations are continuous from the early 20th century to now. Some of the roles include, for instance, Pearl Harbor right now can house 15 nuclear attack submarines, and I saw 6 of them 2 weeks ago in port. They can have aircraft carriers. It's, of course, the location for RIMPAC, the largest naval exercise in the world, every other year. In 2024, I think there were about 30,000 service people here participating in RIMPAC from countries as distant as Israel and England to countries in the Asia-Pacific region. So this is important in terms of the bases, but then also the command is here. So Indo-Pacific Command is here, as you know, and the commands for all of the other services are here to help the United States in its strategic understanding of the importance of the Indo-Pacific region. And they see China as the, quote, pacing threat, as a power that is revisionist, that's trying to overturn the international order. So Hawaii is essential in their view of the U.S. capacity to contain China, and if China should get out of hand and try to invade Taiwan, which is the great concern, then the U.S. thinks it should be able to not just deter, but push back China. So the forces are meant to deter. That is, the threat of either denying the conquest or achieving military success is there, but there's also the threat of punishment, that is, deep strikes into China. That's what these forces are for, to prepare the United States, if deterrence should fail, to conduct deep strikes into the mainland and then hurt the ability of the Chinese military to reinforce its own forces.
Of course, the fuel spills at Red Hill and the contamination of the aquifer is top of mind for people in Hawaii in terms of the environmental damage associated with long-term military legacy and new operations in Hawaii. But what are some of the other environmental costs of housing a military infrastructure of this scale that we might not think of besides Red Hill?
Well, it's not just the water that was contaminated, it's the water use, right? And the effect on the aquifer of drawing water to not just give the people at the bases water to drink or wash their cars with, but water-to-water golf courses with.
And there are a lot of I can't remember how many golf courses the DOD operates around the world,
Yeah,
but it's like hundreds.
Yeah, but there's enough here, right? And the water's precious here, and been stressed by Red Hill, the aquifer in Oahu in particular. But there's also concern on the Big Island, Hawaii, about water and the aquifer under the training area there. But it's the weapons themselves are containing toxic materials such as lead, such as depleted uranium, and there's PFAS for firefighting. That's the poisonous chemical that can also leach into the ground and contaminate groundwater. And so this chemical legacy is there. And there's, in addition, the fact that there's a lot of unexploded ordnance, for instance, at Makua.
Right.
And
not to mention Kaho'olawe.
Right, exactly. 90% of Kaho'olawe was not cleaned up, despite the $400 million that was dedicated to that. And it's only 980 acres of that, I think, are usable. So there's a lot of contaminated land and some water. And then, of course, at the point when there was open burn pits or when there are fires on the military land, there's air pollution as well. There's also the fact that the thousands of military people who are housed on the bases are one thing, but the people who move into the community are also stressing the housing in the in the region, and then that increases housing costs for the average Hawaiian.
Governor Green argues that, these are perilous negotiations with a dangerous foe or a volatile and erratic and aggressive foe, the Trump administration, in terms of negotiating them. So he's arguing that Hawaii should try to get as much as it can without provoking the U.S. to kind of just seize lands by fiat. Do you think there are historical or other location examples that could provide either the people doing the negotiations or the rest, so many advocates in Hawaii who are wishing to have their voice included in the room in some way, that they could draw upon to kind of from Okinawa or elsewhere to sort of think about the best way for Hawaii to position itself vis-a-vis the military during this period of negotiations?
Right. I think there are several areas to consider. One is they may not still be telling everyone about what's going on with Red Hill, but they're not being clear about what's going on the Big Island, right? So with that, there's an aquifer underneath that 133,000 acre base. And what's happening is the military has drilled wells, but apparently they don't use that water because they import water. So does that tell us that there's poisoning? I mean, we need to know, people need to know what's happened to the aquifer under the base. So, and that's not public. There's been very little transparency. So I think that there's a lever right there. Let's find out what's happened in the past and what your plans mean for the harm that will go forward and into the future. There are places in the world where people have gotten U.S. bases either downsized or removed, and there's a process in the United States which occurred post the end of the Cold War called base realignment and closure. Right. So the base realignment and closure process closed about 5% of bases per year for a time. And so that's partly how the United States goes from in the Cold War, from about 2,000 overseas international bases and 2,000 overseas bases to about now 700. But there's also base realignment and closure in the U.S. That process has not been ordered by Congress since 2005. That could happen as well. So there are ways to close these using the law, and people have protested to have bases closed. They protested in Okinawa. They protested in the Philippines, right. U.S. bases, and those were closed. And,
Ecuador.
Right, or even Vieques, the United States right. bombing range in Puerto Rico was closed. I think there are examples, but the process begins with understanding what's going on there and the social, economic, and environmental consequences of what's going on in these places. And then looking at what are the threats that the United States is trying to protect against. Could those threats be addressed in another way? Is there an alternative defense? It turns out there is an alternative way to defend Taiwan, and the Taiwanese are working on it. It's 1,000 small things. That is defense by denial. So we need a comprehensive understanding about what the alternatives are and exploration of the alternatives. Has the Trump administration provided us an analysis of another way? Is there a cheaper way to defend the U.S. interests in the Pacific? A less damaging way? So that, I think, asking questions is part of our role as citizens. And what we know, and I've just participated in editing a volume for the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the journal called Daedalus. It's about democracy and war. We know that in wartime, the levers of democracy, the institutions of a democracy are constrained. Information is less available. The power of the executive is concentrated in their hands, and it's less in the legislature and in the courts.
At least in U.S. history, seems to stay concentrated.
Right, and that's what's happened. We've had the concentration of power and then the use of war as a rationale for non-war things. And so it is patriotic to question and to try to understand. And that's, I think, the thing that people hear if they're concerned about their security at home because of the bases, they can start asking those questions.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Neta, and for doing this research in Hawaii that it sounds like will be of real importance as Hawaii tries to negotiate with the military on these base renewals. So thank you for your insight and for coming and for joining us today.
Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure to be in Hawaii, and I've learned a lot from the people I've talked with. Thank you, Robert, for those insightful questions as well.
I'd like to thank our sponsors. The Better Tomorrow series is a joint venture of the University of Hawaii at Manoa and the Hawaii Community Foundation and Unbound Philanthropy. Neta's visit is also made possible, I understand, from a kind of consortium of supporters, the Aina Aloha Economic Futures, the Sierra Club of Hawaii, the Cost of War Project, your project, as well as the Institute for Policy Studies. Are there any other sponsors, important sponsors I'm leaving out?
No, you got them all.
Thank you for joining us. Thank you for listening. Aloha.